They say that first year of marriage is the hardest, and I suspect that the reason is that a lot of times that's when the in-love part starts to wear off. And so what I'm talking about here is having the communication, scheduling the communication time, scheduling time to talk together, scheduling time to plan, to feed into one another so that you can maintain that. Welcome to Rich in Relationship, and I'm your host, Rich Heller, and today we're talking about the transition from romance to real life. Is it wine or is it water? And really, the question is, after we go from being in love, which we talked about pretty in depth in the last episode, what comes next? Is it juicy like wine or is it flat like water? And if it's water, I read that the capital city of Uruguay right now, the water tastes salty and chemically, or is it New York City water, which is some of the best water in the world? It's like, what's going on in the relationship? What does it taste like? What does it feel like? And you may remember that last week we talked about cracking the love code from romance novel to real life love. And we talked about some of the misconceptions that come up around this. And today we're going to talk more about that transition from in love to real life. And we're going to go more in depth. We're going to unpack that transition. We're going to have some more real stories. We're going to tap some professional opinions, and then we're going to wrap it up. So, as we established last week, in love is a phase, 2 to 3 years, and it can feel like a real Debbie Downer when we come off of it. It's like going on a 2 to 3 year bender and suddenly you wake up. And that they say that first year of marriage is the hardest. And I suspect that the reason is that a lot of times that's when the in-love part starts to wear off for people, because it gets very real in that first year. We go from being two people who are playing and having a good time with each other to living together, having children together, sharing our incomes, and all of our stuff about our families comes crashing in. So what do I mean by that? I mean, we start becoming our parents, because everything that we know about marriage comes from them. And it may feel like all the worst things about our parents' marriage are showing up in this marriage. All the things we swore we were never going to pass on to our kids, all the things we swore we were never going to repeat, we find are being repeated. And it's not unusual to blame our partner for it. She's just like my dad, and he was such a ba-ba-ba-ba. Or he's just like my mom, and she always said da-da-da-da-da. And I get people in my office who talk about this all the time. And I want you to know that when this happens, or if it's happening, it is not indicative that your relationship is failing. It's actually a common part of relationship evolution. There's a psychologist called Robert Sternberg who promoted the triangular theory of love. And basically what he maintained, to spare you a lot of psychobabble, was that relationships naturally evolve from passionate love to what he called companionate love over time. Now, companionate love, the way he writes about it, is just as freaking flat as it sounds like. Like, I don't know about you, but I didn't sign up to have a companion who I feel affection towards. That's what it sounds like, right? Now, Sternberg maintains that it's more than that, but maybe it's just a crappy name. I don't know. But I don't want any part of that. I want, a companion, someone I'm traveling through life with, but I want my partner to uphold our marriage vows. I want my partner to continue to develop and grow as an individual and blossom as an individual. I want them to blossom as my partner, and vice versa. I want them to be invested in my development and growth, and I want them to be invested in my role as their husband, as a father, and as we age up, we take more responsibility in the family. I want them to support me in being the best father, husband, head of the family, whatever it is that I can be, and vice versa. That is a lot more than being a companion. But I digress. Right now, we're talking about the transition. So, we're going from that juicy state of in love, wine all the time, to what seems like water. And it's not even sparkling water. It's flat. Some people like flat water better. I don't. You know what? It's worse than that. It's sparkling water that's gone flat. You can taste that it had bubbles in it once, but now it doesn't. And you're like, why am I drinking this, right? And the trick is, how do we navigate that transition? What happens in that transition? And the problem is that we don't know what's coming. The problem is our parents never gave us the handbook on how to have a good marriage. And that's because, guess what? They really didn't have it. They had the handbook for their marriage, which probably was a sucky marriage, or it was a good marriage, but it was missing some things. And whatever their handbook was, it worked great for them, but each marriage is unique. So how do we make that transition? I have clients named Joseph and Eileen who came to me at this phase when the in-love phase was over. And Joseph is a nurse, very committed nurse, works full-time, puts in a lot of hours. And Eileen is a salesperson for a medical supply company, puts in a lot of hours, and they both went off and put a lot of time and energy into their work. And Joseph, in his off time, was going out with his buddies, and they were all single, and he was married, and it wasn't good. And Eileen was getting more and more anxious, and they were aging up, and they hadn't had children, and so they were weathering this transition really poorly. And the problem was that they didn't do what needs to happen. What needs to happen when we're going from this transition is, number one, we need to make sure that we have our shared vision on the table. So when we get married, very often our shared vision is we're going to have kids and we're going to live happily ever after. Well, you need to fluff that out some if you can. How long do we expect to live happily ever after? 60, 70, 80, 90. How many children do we plan to have? 1, none, 5, 6, 10, whatever. What do we hope is going to happen over what span of time? What kind of schools are we going to send them to? What's the community? What kind of community do we want to raise them in? What kind of household do we want to have? Do we want to live in an apartment? Do we want to live in a house? You want to fluff out as much of that as possible. And unfortunately, what happens is we fall in love, we get married, and we think that everything's going to be peachy keen and wonderful because that's what that in love energy is about. And we forget to talk about what? The future. And when we forget to talk about the future, life starts to happen to us as it did to this couple I was just telling you about. Well, the good news is they came to do work with us, and basically he stopped carousing. They cut back on their hours. They had a child together, getting ready to have another. They're starting to think about their future. They're having regular meetings about their future. Once a year, they sit down and they calendar out the whole year. They put in the school events. They put in when are they going to take their vacation. They map in any big events that are coming up, their friend's marriage, whatever else comes on the radar. Then once a month, they check in and see, all right, what's going on this month? What do we have going on? How are we going to manage this? How are we going to manage that? And then every week, they meet and they see, how are we doing? How are we doing with our plan? How are we doing with our spending plan? How are we doing with our time? What do we need to shift? What do we need to change? Hey, what responsibilities do I have that maybe I can't meet that you can? They got really good at looking forward and managing day-to-day life. And they made sure that in all that structure that they planned in time alone together. They planned in date night. They planned in once a season, every 2 to 3 months. They ship the kids off to Eileen's parents and they go and have like a honeymoon together for a night or a weekend or a long weekend, depending on what they can get in there. And they do that at least 4 times a year. So they're investing in that relationship. And that's how you handle the transition. The problem is we mostly go into the transition unconscious. And when we go into it unconsciously, problems start to happen. We get critical. We get contemptuous. We get defensive. We stonewall. When the whole thing was coming up about going out with the boys, there was a lot of stonewalling going on. This is what I do. It's what I need to do to blow off steam. Leave me alone. John Gottman, calls these the four horsemen of the marital apocalypse: criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. And they're negative behaviors that when they're showing up, it's like the doom drum for a marriage. But as this couple proved, it doesn't have to be the doom drum. You can turn it around. Esther Perel emphasizes the importance of maintaining a sense of self and personal growth, which wasn't happening in this relationship, the personal growth part. They were developing professionally, but not personally. And that personal growth is intimately linked to having a nurturing relationship, supporting each other in personal growth. It requires vulnerability. Brené Brown talks a lot about how we can't have intimate relationships without vulnerability. All right, so I've given you the strategy for communication. Part of that communication and planning is cultivating shared interests, preserving your individual identities, and at the same time nurturing the relationship and having a vision for how you're going to work together in your partnership. And part of working together in a partnership is recognizing each other's strengths and weaknesses and leaning into each other's strengths. A lot of times what happens with couples when they enter this phase is they lean into their individual strengths, but they don't have the synergy of the relationship. Right? So what I'm talking about here is having the communication, scheduling the communication time, scheduling time to talk together, scheduling time to plan, to feed into one another so that you can maintain that. And if you're finding that you're having trouble communicating, that's why we have programs like our couples program. It's a program that, number one, helps couples to disengage from a toxic dynamic. That toxic dynamic that can come up in the transition and often blossom into something really ugly over time is one where I'm going to win and you're going to lose. It's where I get emotionally loud. It's where I get emotionally abusive even. It might even turn into physical abuse, though that's not as prevalent as you might think. And so we teach couples how to stop the negative dynamic. We teach them how to communicate in a way that fosters trust, that fosters empathy, and that fosters caring communication so that there can be intimacy. And we teach them how to build each other up, not tear each other down, and how to make that love decision we talked about in the last episode, the decision that they're going to love each other unconditionally, that they're going to share themselves unconditionally, and that they're going to allow each other, each one, to lead in their strengths. Okay, so we talked about understanding the transition phase. We've talked about the pitfalls. We've talked about, we've brought in some real life experts for a change, not just me. And we've talked about where that can lead. Where it can lead when we make it through the transition phase is that we can start to move forward into a mature romance. We can move into not a companionate love. We don't want that. But what I like to call it is soulmate level marriage. A soulmate level marriage. Soulmates are not born, they're created. And in the next episode, we're going to talk about rekindling the love. It's not unusual for people in the transition phase to get a little lost, right? To not do the things that that couple I was telling you about do. And by the way, just for the record, I changed the names because we do maintain confidentiality. So, and I do mix people's stories together somewhat, because I don't ever want to tell any one couple's story or any one individual story utterly and completely, because if I were listening to this and heard me telling my story exactly when I had paid you to work with me and maintain confidentiality, I'd be mortified. But everything I'm telling you is true and has actually happened. All right, so next episode, rekindling the love. After that, nurturing your relationship and preparing for the next phase. As always, please like us, follow us, subscribe to this channel, recommend us to your friends if you're finding this helpful. Please comment. I'd love to hear what's going on for you. I'd love to hear how this is helping you or how you disagree or it's not helping you. The more interaction and feedback we get, the better we can do with this podcast. Thank you.